As the hours pass, the gang's guard keeps dropping, so she immediately hides her reaction so as not to warn them. Consider Claire to be merely a defenseless pawn in their plan. But in the darkness, Rocky gets ready too. While the group's laughing fades into soft whispers, the desert darkness envelopes them while the bonfire crackles softly. CLA is still bound to the tree in a spooky stillness, her gaze flitting beyond the firelight. She can see men in the shadows, and she knows Rocky is waiting for the proper time to win her heart. Pounds as she softly commands him to pretend that Rocky is hiding behind the meager undergrowth that he has learned to hide behind. His keen eyes focus on the lone lookout as he waits patiently for the ideal moment. With each cigarette hanging from his lips, the man's head sags lower as he leans on a rock. Every minute that goes by, his fatigue dulls his awareness, and then a low grumble rumbles. CLA can hardly hear the sound in Rocky's throat over the crackle of the fire, but it's a signal to her. Rocky advances like a shadow, silent and swift, and her heart quickens as she steels herself for the impending turmoil. Before the watchman can respond, Rocky leaps, his strong teeth snagging on. The lookout screams sharply from the man's arm, but the sound is soon muffled as Rocky pulls him In the dark, the group leaps to their feet, snatching weapons and flashlights as panic erupts among them. What was that Bunner, scrutinizing the shadowed area with his eyes? Jed was clutching a torch. Looks into the night. It's most likely a coyote. The gang should investigate. With their flashlights out and cutting through the night, CLA sees her opportunity and starts to move her wrists, utilizing the noise as a diversion while Rocky stands against the rough rope that is tying her to the tree. His keen intellect calculating the gang's moves, he circles back towards the camp in preparation for the next strike. Identifies Jed as having strayed too far from the group, his torch beam trembling as his anxiety overcomes him with a. Jed screams from his weapon as Rocky runs at him with a low, guttural snarl and crashes into him, knocking him to the ground. The gang hears the disturbance and rushes towards the sound as Rocky snarls inches from his face, clattering out of reach. But before they get there, Rocky disappears into the shadows. "What's happening?" Boone roars. As his annoyance grows, he pulls. When he stood up, he discovered the man shaking and unintelligible. It was the. Boone's face hardens. "That thing is a demon," as Dog Jed stammers. "It's just a dog," he snaps to gain control, but Boone secretly has a pang of uncertainty that this isn't common dog, and he's aware of it. His suspicions increase as he remembers CLA's previous warning that you'll repent. At the tree, CLA underestimates him and eventually releases the rope, allowing her to be free. She moves silently and deliberately, avoiding the gang's view with her wrists and slips. She doesn't flee, she knows. Things would attract attention, so instead she crawls towards the camp's edge, looking for rocky patches with her gaze. As soon as he approaches her, he moves carefully yet deliberately, and when their eyes lock, CLA experiences a rush of. She whispers his name with relief, her voice shaking with emotion. "Rocky, you found me. The reunion is short for me, since Boone's voice pierces the night as I search for her, and that much CLA." Despite the dread in her eyes, she speaks firmly as she stares at Rocky. "We must move." Rocky appears to realize that they will kill us if they catch us, so he takes the initiative to lead Claire out of the camp, and the two advance silently and urgently into the rocky landscape beyond, navigating tight gullies and climbing steep. CLA is amazed by Rocky's accuracy and his ability to move over the dangerous terrain with ease. But there, Boone and his men's brief escape is interrupted by their torches bouncing off the canyon walls as they. Claire realizes they're running out of time as the sound of boots crunching on gravel becomes closer. Rocky stops STS suddenly as he reaches a thin ledge that overlooks a precipitous drop. He turns to CLA, his keen eyes sweeping the surroundings. Abruptly, he barks, a sound full of purpose and urgency. CLA follows his eyes and notices a tiny. Without hesitation, she squeezes inside the rock wall's gap. The cold stone Rocky's muscular frame fits her body snugly, providing just enough support. As the gang's footsteps get louder and their torch beams sweep, they cover their mouths and hold their breath. Boone yells. They couldn't have gone far, Ciela, as they remained frighteningly close. Rocky and Rocky stayed motionless, their bodies tight, as the group passed just a few feet from where they were hiding. The sound of footsteps slowly fade, and Claire lets out a trembling breath before turning to face Rocky and speaking in a scarcely audible whisper. Rocky nuzzles her palm with his nose and warm, radiant eyes, saying, "You saved me again." As the first glimmer of dawn appears on the horizon, Claire gives a silent reassurance, understands that the gang is still pursuing them and that their nightmare is far from done, and their desperation makes them more riskier than before. But with Rocky at her side, she has a glimmer of hope that they might survive. Vibrant as the sun rises, bathing the Rocky Canyon Claire in warm light, and Rocky continue moving forward at a rapid yet methodical pace, navigating the difficult terrain with each stride. Despite the risk, the gang is still looking for them, and their footsteps and cries can be heard faintly in the distance. Feels more determined now. She's not just running, she's planning. Rocky abruptly stops, swiveling his ears. As he crouches with his body coiled like a spring, a low growl exits his throat like radar dishes, and Claire instantly. Her heart sinks as she crouches and follows his sight and sees Boone, the gang's leader, emerge over the crest. With his gun slung casually over his shoulder, his silhouette stands out against the brightening sky. CLA, Boone's voice explodes. "You can flee all you want across the canyon, but you're only making things more difficult for yourself. Come out now, and I might allow you." CLA clenches her fists in response to the mocking remarks, which cause her to feel both angry and afraid. She looks at Rocky, who stays motionless, his amber eyes fixed on the impending danger. CLA is well that Boone won't let up until he receives what he wants, but she's no longer the defenseless victim, so he thinks she's all right. "Rocky," she whispers steadily. Rocky doesn't require any more training, so let's show him who he's truly dealing with despite her beating heart. CLA walks in the opposite direction as he disappears into the shadows, his slender figure fitting in perfectly with the rocky terrain, direction that diverts Boone's focus from her kind partner. She holds a sharp rock in her palm and prepares to use it. If required, Boone pauses as the sound of his boots crunching on loose gravel gets louder as he lowers the ridge. His guys follow him with their weapons as he scans the area with narrowed eyes. Boone orders her to find her immediately, and his voice is brimming with menace. "If you..." When Rocky hears the order, it simply strengthens his resolve. "See that dog, shoot it." Moves like a predator and loops around Boone's group, his keen senses picking up every detail, even the fragrance of. He knows just when to strike because of the men's perspiration, the metallic tang of their weapons. And the minute changes in the wind. A scuffle is heard when a quick, shrill yelp pierces the air. When CLA learns that Rocky has ambushed one of Boone's men, her heart jumps. The chaos attracts the others away from her hiding place, providing her with a fleeting window of opportunity as CLA rushes up Using her hands to support herself on the loose rocks, she ascends a nearby incline to a viewpoint that provides a view of the canyon floor, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she looks at Rocky's creation. When a lost and disarmed gang member lies in the dirt with his weapon nowhere to be seen, someone yells for him to come. Two of his guys, their weapons poised, rush at Rocky in a fit of rage. However, Rocky is already moving, scuttling between the boulders with incredible dexterity as he guides the men through a chaotic chase. They're firing from her position, which echoed futilely against the canyon walls. Near the base of the ridge, where one of the gang members has left his load unguarded, Celia sees an opening and cautiously descends the slope with cautious and accurate motions, then pierces the bag with her fingers. Perfectly circling a little flare pistol, she whispers as a strategy begins to take shape in her brain. CLA goes back to her vantage point with the flare cannon in hand, aiming it skyward with calm hands in spite of the. With a rush of excitement coursing through her veins, she pulls the trigger, causing a scorching streak of red light to shoot into the sky. Miles can see the trail, and when Boone and his men hear the flare, they momentarily lose focus. Using the confusion to his advantage, Rocky makes a planned leap to take down another gang member. Boone roars his patience as he screams and falls to the ground, his weapon clattering out of reach. At last, he snaps and lifts his rifle, aiming it straight at Rocky CLA's heart. Her heart stops, yet she cries and roars. Desperation, but Rocky quickly turns and launches before Boone can draw the shot. Boone throws himself at the gang leader with relentless force, causing his weapon to slip over the. Boone's arrogance crumbles as Rocky towers above him, his teeth clenched in a guttural growl that rumbles in his chest. "It's all right, he stammers, raising his hands in surrender in the face of Rocky's rage. "Call off your doc." With the flare gun still in her grasp, Claire emerges from her hiding place and looks directly at Boone, her expression fierce and unyielding. "You believed I was weak," she continues in a calm voice, "but you misjudged me," and he hears a far-off sound as the smoke from the flare evaporates in the sky. The distinct sound of a. The helicopter's signal has been detected, and assistance is on its way. The sound of the chopper coming gets louder. Boone's gang members, now dispersed and confused debate, was louder than before, breaking the calm of the canyon. Anxious looks, their confidence falters as they realize they hadn't expected this turn of events. CLA maintains her focus on Boone despite the fact that they are no longer in control of the war. Rocky stands above him, his low, frightening teeth bared in warning as his grip tightens on the flare rifle. Boone's. As he looks at the growling dog and calls him off, his swagger is gone and replaced with a mixture of dread and rage. Boone says, his voice shaky a little, "But this isn't over, lady. You believe that a helicopter will change anything, but you're only postponing the unavoidably." CLA comes forward, her face resolute. "You had every opportunity to leave this situation, but you decided on violence. You will now have to deal with the repercussions." Rocky's snarl gets louder as Boone moves a little. Testing his captor's limits with ease, Rocky CLA whispers in a soothing voice. However, giving the dog instructions doesn't cause him to change his attitude. Instead, it makes it obvious that he's in control while the rest of the gang tries to reorganize, their unity disintegrating under the increasing strain. One of the men, who is clearly in a panic, yells, "We have to leave," saying that the helicopter will bring the LW. Running another response, but his tone is unconvinced, so we follow the plan. Claire closely observes their interactions and notes the fractures that are beginning to appear in their unity, knowing that Boone will manage this. Boone's gang is still armed, and desperation can make them dangerous even if the chopper will arrive soon. They are unexpected. The helicopter's sleek black frame shimmers in the sunlight as it comes over the mountain. CLA lifts her arm and waves as the thunderous roar floats over the canyon, its downdraft stirring up dust and debris. The pilot acknowledges their position inside the aircraft by nodding, and a second figure A. The sight of the chopper puts Boone's men into a panic as the park ranger, armed and ready, gets ready to disembark. They launch a warning shot into the air in an attempt to scare the ranger instantly issues a stern warning to drop your firearms via the helicopter's PA system and remain where you are. Help is on its way. The area is encircled. Give up right away so that nobody is harmed. The gang is further shaken by the power in his voice, and two of them drop their guns, their faces turning white with terror. Another pauses, looking at Boone for guidance, but the gang leader doesn't say anything, his thoughts racing for a way out. When Boone CLA declares, "Your time is up," her voice breaks through the confusion. "You can either cooperate or..." Boone glares at her, his jaw clenched, making you feel like you've won, which will make things worse for you and everyone else. "You're right, I don't, but I know this you're dealing with." CLA takes a step closer, her eyes unblinking. "Undervalued me, and you undervalued him," she says, pointing to Rocky, who is alert and keeps his gaze fixed on Boone. The ranger emerges from the helicopter as it lands close by, his weapon aimed on the group of people now on the ground. He commands in a tone that leaves no room for disagreement, and the gang members obey one by one, bending down to their hands behind their heads. Boone briefly struggles to keep his head up due to pride, but Rocky's savage barking, breaking his resolve. He falls on his knees and raises his hands in surrender. The ranger arrives after the gang has been detained. He remarked, "You did the right thing signaling us," with a look of relief and respect on his face. pursuing this group for months, but we never have enough to defeat them. But today's CLA is different because of you." She nods, her excitement now subsiding. "They abducted me because they believed I was a simple goal." She looks at Rocky and softens her voice, but they were unaware of him. Rocky is regarded with renewed respect by the ranger, who thinks he's an amazing dog. He has fought his fair share of wars. As the ranger, he saved lives before today, including mine. CLA smiles weakly. As another ranger investigates the van the Outlaws used during the kidnapping, they discover a treasure trove of pilfered items, including jewelry, electronics, and even documents that may indicate involvement in a more serious crime. Boone stays obstinate despite the fact that the revelation solidifies their fate and increases the gravity of their crimes, yet the weight of. He gives Claire a final stare as he is led away in handcuffs, demonstrating his apparent guilt. Yuk regrets. "This isn't over," he murmurs, and Claire looks him in the eye without flinching. Now that the immediate threat has been eliminated, Claire pauses to catch her breath before kneeling next to Rocky and rubbing her fingers together. Gratitude fills her voice as she exclaims, "We did it, buddy," through his fur. For the first time in hours, CLA feels at ease as the dog leans in her touch, his devotion steadfast. After the gang is apprehended and the dust settles, CLA finally takes a minute to release the adrenaline that has been pumping through her. The heavy weight of all that has just happened replaces the pressure coursing through her veins, and she observes as the Rangers lead Boone and his men to vehicles that are waiting, and they look defeated at sullen as the group vanishes from. Observe that something about Bunk's final remarks bothers her and nags at the back of her mind. As he was being dragged away, Boone mumbled, "I regret this." His voice was tinged with a low, threatening a promise instead of a threat. CLA tries to brush it off by shaking her head. She glances down at Rocky, who appears equally anxious, his ears twitching at every sound, yet the memory clings stubbornly. This is not over the ranger who had assumed the lead, and the dog senses it too. With the CLA clipboard in hand, he says to Miss Sanders in an earlier tone, "To complete your statement, you will need to visit the station tomorrow, but in the meantime, you should prioritize getting some rest, even when it seems strange to CLA. Thank you. I'll be there." As the ranger walks away, someone else comes up with a tiny gadget that we discovered on. According to one of the gang members, giving his colleague the GPS tracker suggests that they were working with someone. If not, the coordinates point to a place roughly 50 miles north of CLA's heart. Sinks, asking the lead ranger, "What does that mean?" in a worried tone.
Frowns examining the gadget, which may indicate that Boone and his group aren't operating alone. As they talk, Rocky suddenly perks up, standing upright, and his ears perking up, suggesting that there may be more to this procedure than we initially thought. He twitches his snout and growls softly, staring at neighboring ridge CLA. Notices nothing unusual when he follows his line of sight, only the rocky cliffs and scant foliage of. Rocky's response in the canyon still makes her uneasy, but she knows better than to. Rock crouches next to him and says, "What is it, boy?" disregarding his instincts. The ranger is sufficiently unnerved by the air once more, his body taut, and his tail rigid, whatever he senses, observes the exchange and approaches, asking whether he has been prepared for this kind of scenario. CLA nods, and Rocky, a retired warg, nods. He is educated to recognize danger before it materializes. If his expression tightens, we should heed his warning. The Rangers made arrangements for CLA and Rocky to be taken to a secure location so that we can get you out of here. Secure area until they ascertain the scope of the gang's activity. And though Claire is hesitant to depart, she acknowledges knowing. As they go along the twisting roads that lead out of the canyon, Rocky stays vigilant because it's the safest option for the time being. In the rear of the car, CLA sits silently with her thoughts while his eyes explore the horizon and his body coils like a spring. She keeps thinking that Boone's gang is just the tip of the iceberg and that what they were truly pursuing was it just a crime of opportunity, or was her kidnapping a part of a bigger scheme? The ranger behind the wheel looks at her in the rearview mirror and remarks, "You're lucky to have that dog." Braking. Few people can say that their best friend is also their bodyguard, but CLA manages to smile a little. Furthermore, Rocky has saved lives, including mine, and experienced things that most people can't even fathom. The ranger shows his appreciation by nodding. So let's hope he's mistaken this time, and there won't be any more issues. The safe spot turns out to be a remote cabin tucked away in the forest, far from prying eyes. It has rudimentary conveniences and an emergency satellite phone. CLA exits the car and surveys her surroundings. This is where the mayhem she left behind is contrasted with the thick forest and the soft chirping of birds. You'll remain for the time being, the ranger explains, adding that we have a patrol that comes by to check on you. Sweeps the area every several hours. CLA is grateful to him, but she feels uncomfortable with the thought of being alone while the rangers travel away, leaving her and Rocky alone. She locks the door as the circumstance weighs heavily on her. Behind her, and kneels next to Rocky, who seemed to be feeling the same way. "We'll be all right, boy," she whispers, caressing his fur. "Experienced worse." But even as she utters those words, a shiver goes through her. The forest itself seems to be holding its breath that night as CLA, and there's something strange about the silence. Rocky's growl wakes her up as she lies in bed, and she sits up with a racing heart, beating and paying close attention. The cabin is quiet save for the slight sound of leaves moving outside, and Rocky stands at the CLA whispers is grasping the window, his body tight, and his eyes fixed on the tree line. She shines the flashlight from the bedside table outside, but nothing is visible because of the thick underbrush. It is still Rocky. Keeps his snarl going as he paces back and forth, making CLA's heart race since she knows that Rocky's instincts are rarely wrong. "Remain here," she tells him in a firm voice as she reaches for the satellite, anxiety beginning to seep in her breast. "This is CLA Sanders," she says as she picks up the phone and dials the ranger station, keeping her eyes fixed on the window. The ranger on the other end doesn't hesitate to stay inside and keep trying to connect even if I believe someone is outside the cabin. Claire hangs up, takes a big breath, and says, "All the doors are locked, and we're sending a patrol your way." CLA pacing the floor of the poorly lighted cabin. She knows one thing is certain. This isn't over. Rocky sits by the door with his ears perked up while she tries to calm her racing nerves. As the weight of the situation pushes down on her, something she is accustomed to, and his body coiled like a spring ready to act. Peril. But the loneliness intensifies every noise and every shadow. CLA. Make sure the line is open and prepared in case the rangers call back the minutes by checking the satellite phone once more. Tick by in a painful quiet, she kneels next to Rocky, her hand shaking. She whispers, "Do you think I made a mistake, boy? I should have pressed harder for answers." He strokes his fur. Perhaps Rocky's low growl in the canyon brings her back to the present by jolting her thoughts. His body stiffens. As his gaze focuses on the window, CLA follows him, gasping as she notices a slight movement in the shadows. She screams out to someone outside as she tightens her hold on the flashlight. Rocky's growl rises, but her voice stays firm despite the panic mounting in her chest. The woodland is unnaturally calm. As a precaution, CLA takes the rifle the rangers left behind, but before she can do so, a mysterious figure moves in. CLA sparkles as her finger hovers over the trigger while their hands are raised in a surrender gesture into the moonlight. With a flashlight on them, a man in his mid-40s can be seen, his face Ed and his. "I'm not here." The man shouts out in a weak voice, his garments tattered. "Please don't fire." CLA hesitates to harm you, the gun becoming heavier in her grasp. "Who are you, man? What do you want?" Moves forward with caution. "My name is Mark, and I was a member of Boone's team, but I wasn't there voluntarily. I fled when I saw the rangers approaching. Please trust me when I say that." Rocky growls, inching once more. CLA's instincts tell her to be cautious as she approaches the door. "Why should I trust you?" she asks, as Mark lowers his. His hands moved a little, and his eyes glowed in desperation. "Because I knew something about Boone's plan that you didn't. We're not just after you. There's a larger scheme going on, and allowing Mark inside might be a trap." She looks down at Rocky, who is staring at the screen, but if he is telling the truth, his information could be vital. Man outside, she decides to stay put, following her dog's intuition. Unlock the door and knock. But keep it chained, she continues. If you try anything, this door will close and the Rangers will. Mark nods and his body trembles clearly. But it's fair enough. Just listen to. Claire holds the weapon in her hands while she listens and begins speaking. Mark inhales deeply, eyes darting tensely between the forest line and Scylla. Boone's gang wasn't only out to her profit. They were a part of. When a network of people and weapons traffickers nabbed you, it wasn't happenstance. They had orders to intercept you. The reason you were spotted with the Rangers, Mark, in particular, makes my stomach turn. Reveals that they thought you were assisting them in looking into their roots. Boone wanted to get influence over someone in the Rangers. Wouldn't risk abandoning Scylla, who clenches her jaw in rage that simmers beneath the surface, and you simply followed orders. Mark recoils at her tone. They threatened my family, and I had no choice. I was merely the driver, and I vowed to stop participating when I realized how far Boone was prepared to go. Rocky. His roar softens as he gets closer to the door, but his body remains stiff. CLA. She focuses on Mark and asks, if what you're saying is true, why come here? Why not go straight to the Rangers? Mark pauses. His face was laced with guilt because Boone isn't finished yet. They're regrouping because he had a backup plan in case the first one didn't work. CLA is holding the rifle titans at a nearby hideout, and reinforcements are on the way. Why are you telling me this? I don't want anyone else to get it. So Mark stares her in the eye, his desperation turning to honesty. If you let the Rangers know where they're hiding, they might be able to stop this before it becomes worse. CLA backs off. She has a lot of questions and doesn't fully believe Mark, but his tale makes sense. Given what she already knows, allowing him to go could result in the loss of an important information source or worse. Finally, she adds, I'll call the Rangers if he's lying, but you're staying here, putting herself in even more danger. Mark nods in relief till they get there, which is understandable, and CLA locks the door once more. She looks at Rocky, whose eyes are still alert, even though his posture has slightly relaxed. CLA is aware that she's walking a tightrope between caution and trust in a scenario where one mistake may cost her everything in the cabin. Was quiet save for the slight crackle of the fireplace fire, and CLA continued to watch Mark, who was seated on an old chair. Rocky was lying at her feet next to the entrance, his eyes never leaving the stranger, and his sporadic growls served as a reminder of the satellite phone's high-pitched tone abruptly broke the tense CLA in the chamber of tenuous trust. Officer Garrett, the ranger she had previously spoken to, was on the other end of her response, keeping her firearm within reach. As we're traveling to your place, Garrett mentioned that we've overheard some conversation that supports what you told us about Boone's. CLA looked at Mark as the party regrouped at an old logging site about 10 meters away from you. Reinforcements are on their way. I have someone here named Mark who says he's one of Boone's men, but he says he's attempting to. There was a pause on the line when he told me about the hideout, so please be careful. Given that Boone's group has a reputation for trickery, if Mark is sincere, he could be crucial. Witness, but you understand the stakes I have if he's lying, CLA said in a stern voice. After hanging up, Claire went to Mark and said, I'll take care of it. The Rangers are coming if. Mark stopped, his eyes dropping to the ground. If there's anything else you're hiding, now's the time to come clean. Boone has one more thing. A list of locals who have been assisting the Rangers' residents. Supplying information. Claire felt a shiver go down her spine if he reached there before the Rangers did. You're telling me. I heard Boone discussing one, but I didn't see the names on that list. Do you know who's on it? Mark shook his head. Her brother's breath caught when he heard that one of them lived close to this cabin. Could she be on that list? Or worse, one of her neighbors? The idea that Boone's team would target defenseless individuals made her more determined before. CLA could continue to question Rocky, who leaped to his feet, let out a low roar, and he walked menacingly to the window, his nose twitching and his ears perked up. CLA grabbed the weapon and slipped to the window, where flashlights' dim glimmer flickered through the trees as they peered into the darkness. She heard voices and saw at least 3 figures warily approaching the cabin. They are here, she muttered, her gut clenched. If Boone's men find you, Mark's face will be pale. Claire gestured for Boone, who doesn't put up with traitors, to come here because they'll kill us all. She said, Stay quiet and turn a Rocky stay-ready boy." The dog's eyes glowed with comprehension as the men outside approached him as he stood close to the door, his body tight. CLA could hear snippets of their conversation as their voices became clearer. Boone instructed them to explore this place, and one of them remarked his. This time, a different voice replied, "What about the ranger team? If she's here, we grab her without any mistakes." When the first man said, "They'll be here soon, doesn't matter," Boone responded, "I want her alive." And CLA prevented him from finishing if the dog got in the way, pulling away from the window as her thoughts raced. They were outnumbered and couldn't risk a direct confrontation because any gunfire would attract more attention, but she wasn't. As she was about to let them take her, or Rocky Mark, she said, "It's urgent, do you? I've utilized the trails to reach Boone's hideout. There's a limited route here." Mark nodded, his face still pallid. "The steep hill leading to higher ground behind the chalet will buy us time while Claire weighs her alternatives." The route was their best option, but staying in the cabin was too dangerous since if Boone's men entered, it would be a death trap. Chance, but it would require giving up the cabin's relative safety. So she said she made up her mind and will take the path. "But if you even attempt to put us in danger, I won't," Mark answered hastily. "I'm positive CLA got the necessities, including a little first aid kit, a torch, and her firearm." She silently opened the rear door and motioned for Rocky to remain near Mark. Watched him closely as they disappeared into the night. The trail was just as dangerous as Mark had warned of the rocks, moved beneath their feet, and the thick undergrowth hindered their advancement. CLA kept her flashlight low too. Rocky led the way, following his senses at every ruffle, detecting the lights scouring the cabin behind them. CLA's pulse raced at the sound of leaves or a twig snapping, but the dog stayed composed and concentrated, offering her a brief moment of comfort midway down the trail voices. Boone's men had found the empty cabin and were dispersing to explore the area so the sound reverberated through the forest, signaled for everyone to stop, her heart racing as a bright beam came perilously close to Rocky's crouching body. Mark's breathing was shallow, his ears were flat against his head, and CLA could sense the stress emanating from. The men seemed oblivious to their proximity as the voices became louder, and Claire clutched the gun firmly, prepared to defend herself if needed. But before the men could see them, the night heard a howl in the distance, possibly from a coyote or CLA silently praised the woodland for its unexpected ally once the distraction was sufficient to entice them away. The three arrived at the higher ground Mark had indicated after what seemed like a lifetime, and from their vantage point they could see that Boone's men were now encircling the cabin below, and their torches were moving erratically while the hunt went on. She sighed softly, saying, "Weck's safe for now," as her adrenaline started to fade. High above the cottage on the rocky plateau at night, she realized that even though the words were hollow, this was just the beginning. The chilling hum of Boone's men hunting below sent chills through the chilly air. As Mark flopped close by, clearly disturbed, CLA rested on a large boulder to collect her breath. With his ears alert to every rustle and whisper, the vigilant paced in a tight circle. CLA looked at Mark in the trees, her head whirling with contradictory feelings. She couldn't afford to trust him, but his understanding of Boone's business practices had already been helpful. Mark hesitated, kneading his hands together as she asked, her voice piercing the deep silence. Fearfully, "If they can't find you, they'll go to the hideout to get their bearings and decide what to do next." Boone's not. CLA's jaw tensed as the kind to give up, and the individuals on that list are in. Mark nodded gravely when he said, "If Boone believes they've been compromised, he lives on terror and will not think twice about taking revenge." The seriousness of the situation struck CLA like a punch to the. Nevertheless, she was unable to concentrate solely on her personal security because Boone's vendetta might put others in danger. Rocky trotted over to her as CLA pondered Mark's words, looking in her eyes for confirmation, and she knelt next to him. As her palm brushed through his thick fur, his composed manner brought back memories of their past conflicts. "And made it through together, good boy. We'll get through this, Mark," she whispered. As he observed the exchange, a glimmer of adoration crossed his face. "It's amazing," he exclaimed. CLA straightened, looking into his eyes, and you could see he would sacrifice his life for you. Mark hesitated before asking what his narrative was about how a battle works. But he saved me more times than I can count, and I owe him everything. Claire contemplated whether or not to disclose that Doug ended up in the middle of nowhere with someone like you. But something in Mark's. Rocky served with me overseas, and I was his handler when I made her give in. We've been a team since. Mark nodded slowly. I'm glad you're retired, but I couldn't leave him behind. CLA offered a. They were startled by the distant sound of an engine rumbling through the forest, which I believe is the opposite of the slight smile. Returning to the present, CLA signaled to Rocky to keep quiet while crouching low among the thick wood she saw. Mark's cheeks turned pale as he heard headlights and the distant bounce off the rough ground. That's Boone, he muttered. I thought you said he would stay at the hideout. Mark shook his head, but I saw the truck. CLA's heart quicken, and he's here. They saw the vehicle stop close to them and said, if he's coming himself, it means he's getting desperate. Boone emerged from the cabin, his towering figure silhouetted against the headlights. His voice carried through the night as he yelled commands to his men. I can sense that she's approaching, and I've located that traitor Mark. He won't go very far, and Mark retreated in terror. Boone's men would soon discover the track leading up, so they couldn't stay on the plateau forever. She needed a strategy, and quickly as CLA surveyed the plateau's topography, an idea started to take shape. Provided a natural bottleneck where they could regulate the attacker's movement. So she went to Mark Boone's. Mark said that all men carry radios in order to stay in contact with Claire. We're going to send them a message they won't forget. When their eyes brightened with resolve. Mark scowled. What are you? As she looked at Rocky, a plan began to take shape in her mind. We're going to give them the impression that they've entered a. Mark hesitated. But if we can frighten them enough, they'll retreat for at least as long as it takes the Rangers to arrive. The determination in CLA's eyes was unwavering. What are you asking me to do? Claire told Mark to collect rocks and branches to make decoys that would look like more individuals who were hiding on the plateau in the meantime. She used her. She murmured to Mark, stay low, to signal Rocky, who appeared to comprehend her intentions right away. Completed the setup, so that Mark nodded his hands when Boone's men approached, giving the impression that they were surrounded, shakily clutching a big branch. But what about Boone? CLA's expression. I'll deal with him as one of Boone's guys. Claire and Rocky shifted into position as they got closer to the trail, and she used a whistle she had saved from her time in military. With a series of incisive orders, Rocky rushed into the shadows and let out a loud bark to give the impression that several dogs. Boone's troops halted as the rustle of decoys and the echo of his movements added to the confusion. Did you hear that one mutter? Another said, it sounds like there's a whole bunch of flashlight lights darting around. CLA's calm, commanding voice came from the shadows. You're encircled. Drop your weapons and back off. The men halted, looking at each other uncertainly, with Boone standing farther away. Back said, don't listen to her. She's bluffing. But Rocky's calculated moves and improvised. Decoys started to lose confidence. One man retreated, his hand shaking. What if she wasn't bluffing? Boone's men started to back off as he lowered his spotlight. Boone, however, held his ground and scanned the area as they approached the vehicle, their tensions ebbing under the strain. He yelled, when I find you, you'll wish you never crossed. Darkness with icy resolve, you can't hide forever. Claire kept her hold on the rifle solid as she observed me from her hiding place, knowing that this was far from done. Yet, as the echoes of Boone's warnings vanished into the darkness, Claire, they had gained valuable time for the moment. Her thoughts were racing as she huddled behind a boulder, knowing that they couldn't hold out indefinitely because the illusion had succeeded for the time being. However, Boone wasn't the kind to give up easily. While she planned their next course of action below, her heart raced. Boone, his annoyance exploding, yelled instructions at his remaining men. Get back here, all of you. Venom-laced, she's a hound and a lady, and we're not going to lose this fight grudgingly. The men reassembled by the. Boone paced like a caged predator, his gaze sweeping the black surroundings as the truck cast nervous glances over their shoulders. This ends tonight, he growled, and there will be no more games on the trail that leads to the plateau. Claire could see the resolve written on Boone's face from her vantage point. He wasn't going to back down, going to intensify her thoughts, which were racing with potential needs for an advantage. Mark, who was still crouching next to her, muttered, "We can't take them," something that would tip the scales in their favor. CLA's jaw clenched. "But we don't have to take them all. We only." She looked at Rocky, who remained watchfully at her side, knowing that she needed to keep them off balance long enough for assistance to arrive. CLA's ears perked up at every sound, so she dug inside her rucksack and took out a tiny signal flare for her final. As she was ready to retreat, the flare would operate as a distraction and a call for assistance if Boone's men approached too closely. Rocky tensed up and fixed his gaze on a shadow that was approaching the edge of the room while she explained her idea. CLA followed his eyes and first felt her breath catch in her throat as she saw a figure slowly ascending the trail. She was afraid it was one of Boone's men, but she recognized the key outfit as the man entered the dim moonlight. When the park ranger arrived, she gestured for him to come softly as a wave of relief washed over her. "I'm Ranger Stevens, and we received your message," he said as he knelt down. "The backup is on its way, but it will take some time." Claire gave him a briefing, pointing to the. Stevens nodded his face as the others gathered around Boone's truck, saying, "Grim, we must. Do you know how to prevent them from moving forward?" Claire held up a flare this way. "Hold them here till the others come." Boone rallied his troops and equipped them with flashlights, bats, and other weapons that might buy us some time below. The group started. "Hunting rifle, we're going up there," he snarled, "and we're not coming back down until we have her." Claire asked Stevens if we could slow down as they ascended the trail, their footfall crunching against the uneven surface. Stevens nodded, looking around the area, and he saw that we might be able to direct them into a choke spot. "We can take advantage of the tight pass approximately 50 feet down the trail." CLA Stevens, Marks, and Rocky made quick moves to the choke point by constructing a temporary barrier out of fallen branches and rocks, which would compel Boone's men to. Rocky moved to the front in single file, his low growls resonating through the darkness as Boone's men's sound intensified. Louder, their spotlights piercing the night. Scylla lifted the flare, prepared to light it at any time. As Boone's first soldiers arrived at the narrow pass, Stevens mumbled, "Come, better hurry. Grab my radio back up." The man froze his beam as Rocky growled fiercely, his sharp fangs piercing the air. Trembling in his hand, "What the dog?" he yelled. "Keep going, Boone." Pushing the man forward from behind. "It's only a dog." He hesitated, but persisted and over the temporary barrier. The man staggered back with a yelp as Rocky pounced and snapped at his heels. Boone yelled, and CLA grabbed the. When the flare was ignited and thrown toward Boone's gang, a bright red light burst into the darkness, illuminating. "It's a trap," one of the men cried, dropping his weapon and scurrying back into the forest, shocking the attackers. Rocky's unrelenting presence and the flare's abrupt flash of light sent a surge of panic through Boone's group. A number of men pulled back, shattering Boone's confidence, but continued to act like defiant cowards, shouting, "She's bluffing, H. It's only one woman." But as he rushed forward and confronted CLA, who had a rifle aimed at him, Stevens and Mark were waiting behind her, clearly determined. "It's over, Boone," CLA remarked in a firm voice. "Your men are gone, and the police are coming. You have two options. Leave, or make things worse for yourself." Boone's eyes sharpened. Before he could react, he looked back at the trail and heard sirens piercing the night air. As the sirens became louder, Boone realized his time was running out and his surviving soldiers fled their places. Boone stood toward the truck, frozen between fighting and running. Rocky took a stride forward with a deep, deadly growl, and Boone's gaze flicked to the dog before. As Stevens dropped his firearm and raised his hands, Scylla sighed resignedly. Claire maintained her rifle aimed at him. "You made the right decision," she stated in a chilly voice as she moved in to cuff him. "This isn't over," he mumbled, glaring at her. "Yuk, I regret crossing you," CLA didn't answer her, instead turning her attention to the sound of vehicles arriving. The cavalry had come as the flashing police car lights created red and blue patterns in the woodland. CLA Finley released a breath she wasn't aware she had taken. Boone, whom she had been holding, stood cuffed and defiant, his eyes darting over the incoming officers as though seeking an escape route. Even in defeat, Ranger Stevens' commanding presence served as a warning that the threat remained. Forward, his commanding tone piercing the tense atmosphere. Boone Caldwell, you're being held for kidnapping. Boone hissed. Anything you say can and will be used against you for attempted assault and trespassing on protected land. However, he kept quiet, a silent defiance that made CLA's skin crawl as the officers moved to secure Boone's men. CLA focused on the handful that remained, who were gathered close to the truck with their hands in. Under the bright glow of police flashlights, the air and faces were pallid. One officer came up to CLA with his notebook open. CLA Matthews is correct. We'll need a detailed account from you regarding what transpired here. Claire nodded, clearly exhausted. Naturally, but first we must make sure those individuals don't return because they are familiar with the area and if they stray. The cop raised a hand, saying, "We have them under control. We have been following Boone's group for months thanks to your tip." Rocky kept watch by CLA's side during the necessary interval while the officers worked, never taking his eyes off Boone the dog. Boone saw his lips curl into a mocking smirk, but his posture remained tight and his instincts were still on high alert. "What's wrong?" Boone, the dog, scoffed, fearing that I would return. Rocky growled loudly. CLA put a comforting hand on his head and spoke, her teeth bared in mute warning. Boone's smile wavered as Rocky said, calm but firm, "Ignore him, boy. He's not worth it." Maintained his position, the dog's unblinking stare frightening even the seasoned outlaw. Mark Korn, who had been silent during the first commotion, approached Claire with a low, almost hesitating voice. "I always thought you were tough, Claire, but you show me today that you're." CLA looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "But more than that, you're fearless." "I'm not fearless, Mark. Terrified, but fear doesn't prevail when it comes to safeguarding what's important." Her words lingered in the air, resonating with a weight that stifled even Mark's customary bluster. He glanced at Rocky before turning back to CLA. "Your dog. Is there anything else you taught him well?" "Rocky showed me how to trust," CLA said, smiling slightly. Boone turned his head as he was being escorted toward one of the police cars to learn how to defend himself when it matters. "You believe this is over?" Since he glared at CLA and spoke in a hushed voice that was solely intended for her. Claire didn't flinch. Instead, she held his eyes with unyielding resolve. "People like me don't stay behind bars for very long. And people like me remember that the next time, Boone, you won't have the opportunity to run the cop who was escorting him." A shove, he growled, and the exchange ended with Boone stumbling a little but getting back up, his teeth clenched as he was. Officers swept the area after being pushed into the back seat, and Boone and his guys were secured, gathering proof and recording the harm done by the outlaws. Claire finally leaned her body against a tree, giving in to the night Ranger Stevens' fatigue. He approached his expression with a mixture of relief and appreciation. "You performed well tonight, Claire. Without you, things might have turned out much differently." "Rocky merits the praise," Claire told her. Stevens put his palm on the dog's head and said, "He's the one who kept us safe." He nodded even. "Therefore, it requires a strong person to handle a dog like him. You two had gained a great deal of respect tonight," before he could continue. As he left, CLA knelt next to Rocky. The dog's ears perked up, and an officer summoned Stevens over to go over some evidence. Rocky licked her fingers as she whispered to him, "We're almost done, boy. Just a little more, and we can go home." Mark, who had been hovering around, eventually spoke in response to his unshakable allegiance. "CLA, I understand that now may not be the appropriate moment, but why didn't you inform me of his history as a retired war dog?" She paused, examining Mark's face. It wasn't about preserving secrets. Rather, it was about keeping him safe. Rocky has endured enough. I didn't want anyone to view him as a tool or a weapon. Mark nodded slowly and thoughtfully, saying, "You're right. He does. And so do you as the night. He deserves better than that." As the flashing lights dimmed, the police started to pack away their gear. One by one, the force fell. CLA took a long breath and tightened her grip as the confrontation's echoes continued to reverberate into an uncomfortable silence. Rocky's leash, she was aware that the evening was not yet finished, that there were still questions to be answered, choices to be made, and a tale to tell. "Say, But for the time being, they had made it through, and that was plenty. The woodland was quiet, suddenly appeared to be humming with the weight of what had happened. The officers had completed gathering evidence and boons. Claire couldn't get rid of the IL feeling of relief as the men were led to waiting vehicles with their heads lowered. Sensing that the fight was not yet over, Ranger Stevens came up to Claire, his forehead wrinkled. "We have Boone and his gang, but he has been involved in smuggling rare creatures and antiquities for years. But something doesn't seem right." CLA scowled at her because tonight's antics didn't suit his typical patterns. Momentarily distracted by fatigue. "What are you saying?" "I'm stating that Boone might not have been present specifically for you, because there's a..." Stevens sadly looked toward the police car where Boone was sitting and stated, "He knows we're missing the bigger picture." Rocky's sneer remained obvious despite his face being darkened, and he growled softly. Body tense, CLA followed his sight to see Boone looking at her, unable to ignore her with an unervingly calm expression. As CLA followed her intuition, 2 officers stood watch but let her get a. She lowered herself just enough to speak, looking into Boone's eyes through the partially open window. "What's your game?" Despite her seething, she asked in a firm voice. "Boone, why target me and my dog?" Boone laughed angrily as he leaned back in his chair. "You think this is about you, sweetie? You're disappointing that dog. Rocky has a reputation, even if he's the prize." CLA's blood raced cold. "What are you talking about?" Boone continued to speak in a mocking tone outside the military. "You don't believe people notice when a combat dog likes. When he vanishes from view, some extremely interested parties would spend a lot of money to obtain him." Rocky's leash tightened, and he grinned broadly. "You're lying. No one is after him. Whatever you think, I would sleep with one eye open if I were you. This isn't over, though, because the cop intervened and cut you off." CLA remained frozen, her mind whirling as Boone taunted her and slammed the door shut. As the officers were getting ready to depart, was Rocky really safe? Or had Boone's remark sowed a doubt that she couldn't shake? As Boone's men broke free from their chains and ran toward the woods, mayhem broke out as the officers frantically must respond without hesitation by yelling commands and pulling their weapons. "Rocky." CLA yelled his name as he went into action, his strong body rushing forward and his training beginning. In a flash, Rocky tackled the escaping man, pinning him to the ground, demonstrating his complete command of the situation. Ground with unexpected accuracy, the officers swiftly snatched the culprit and gave a startled nod of. CLA knelt next to Rocky and said, "Respect the dog. He's more than just a pet." One cop shook his head in shock. Her hands were shaking as she caressed his fur. "Good boy," she said in a heartfelt whisper. "You're amazing." Everyone's anxiety was raised by the escape attempt, and it became evident that Boone had more control over his soldiers than. Claire couldn't get rid of the suspicion that Boone's operation was more extensive than they had discovered tonight. Stevens returned to her, his tone solemn. "We're going to investigate the Boone network if..." He was right when he indicated that there might be other people interested in Rocky, so you'll need to exercise caution. CLA nodded, resolve hardening. "We'll be prepared when the scene cleared," and Mark got close to CLA. "CLA, I owe you an apology," he said with an extremely serious expression before starting to shake his hands. Incredibly perplexed by her question, he stuffed it inside his jacket pockets. "I assumed you only wanted a friend and didn't truly need Rocky, but tonight I witnessed what he's ability to do and what you can do as a team, and I appreciate that." CLA grinned a little and thanked Mark, but trust is more important than respect. "Rocky helped me learn to trust once more." "You're right, and for what it's worth, I'm happy that I trusted him with everything tonight." Mark nodded, his face softening. With Boone and his warriors finally safe, and the jungle peaceful once more, he's on your side. CLA is getting ready to depart Rocky. The Protector Ranger stood by her side, his body in Lang language, calm but vigilant at all times. Stevens shook her hand firmly and told her to take care of CLA and keep the puppy close, because he was more valuable than she had realized. The weight of the night was on her as she and Rocky walked back to her pickup, his eyes and voice firm. "He's worth everything." Started to rise. The air appeared fresher, and the stars above seemed brighter, as though the woodland itself was breathing a sigh of relief. As CLA drove home, her mind was racing with feelings of thankfulness, anxiety, and determination. Despite being disturbed by Boone's remarks, she refused to let them dictate what she would do next. Rocky's future would be one of strength and defense because of his background, and if Boone, or anyone else, believed that if they came for them, they would be prepared. The headlights' radiance cut through the night as Claire ran. As Rocky got closer to the tiny cabin they called home, the once comfortable silence became oppressive. Boone's words reverberated in her mind as the shadow in the trees cast a menacing presence. However, she dismissed them, concentrating on the steady sound of Rocky's breathing next to her. The cabin was cozy and, as she greeted the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the subtle perfume of pine from her handcrafted candles, Rocky sniffed as he walked around the living room, locking the door behind her, and inspected it twice before drawing the curtains. He sat at the door, his ears alerting it, and looked at windows and corners as though conducting his own security check. When Rocky's roar shattered the stillness, it was long after midnight. She retrieved the flashlight and a large wrench she kept near the door of Rocky's house from the couch, her heart racing. Growling, he stiffened his posture and fixed his gaze on the person outside the front window. There was silence for a minute as the CLA called, her voice steady but wavering. CLA's blood turned cold as she heard a slight rustle outside the window, and then the distinct crunch of boots on gravel. Rocky gave a harsh, authoritative bark that made her realize that whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide their presence. Jumping to the window, he positioned himself like a coiled spring, poised to leap. CLA edged. A flashlight beam swept across the yard, allowing a better look through a crack in the curtains, revealing two persons in. CLA's pulse sped as she whispered to Rocky to stay, and he obeyed his body as the dark garments moved toward the cabin. Tension-stricken and clutching the wrench, she walked to the rear door and made sure it was locked before. She knew that the first sound of the door handle shaking as she returned to the living room gave her a rush of adrenaline. When a rough voice said, "Open up and we won't hurt you," CLA's hand shook and she spoke. With steady, "Go now or you'll regret it." The reply was, "You've got a sinister laugh. Has guts, but we'll see how long that lasts." As he waited for CLA's, Rocky gave a deep, low growl, his muscles torturing. She signaled by crouching next to him and holding his collar with her free hand as she waited. She spoke in a barely audible whisper as the door exploded, splintering the wood as the intruders. Rocky threw himself at the first man, his strong jaws clamping, after they made their way inside but failed to go very far. The man yelled and dropped the crowbar he was holding onto the intruder's arm. The second man lunged at CLA, who swung. He grunted and staggered back when the wrench struck his shoulder with all of her strength, but he soon recovered. Rocky held firm while she grabbed her wrist and twisted away the adrenaline, which sharpened her motions. He was the first man down, and his piercing growls and barks filled the cabin as he steadfastly guarded CLA. With determination, the second man backed toward the door after recognizing he was outmatched. "This isn't worth it," he said to his companion. But the first man was unable to break free from Rocky's bloody hold. Flowed down his arm while he screamed in agony. CLA reached for her phone and dialed 911, speaking steadily in spite of. "There are two intruders in my house, which is located at 205 Maple Grove. Please hurry up." As the intruders became alarmed by the sound of approaching sirens, the second man fled, abandoning his accomplice. As Claire gave the order, Rocky let go, and the wounded man collapsed to the ground, grasping his arm. Officers rushed in as red and blue lights suddenly filled the chamber. Rocky swiftly secured the area by standing beside Sid, his chest heaving while his calm manner as though he was aware that the struggle was over. But when the police interrogated CLA, "We located their vehicle down the street. It is registered to one of the officers who approached her with a somber expression. Boone's associates appear to have been sent here to complete the task he began." And Claire felt sickened by what Boone said. It had been a promise rather than just a threat. But as she gazed at Rocky's calm eyes, she realized she wasn't alone in this battle. "Do you believe they'll return?" she questioned in a hushed voice, and the officer paused. "Bolster local patrols and keep you informed. But if Boone's network is as vast as we believe you should be." And while the police handled the situation, one of them crouched next to Rocky and scratched behind his ears. "This dog is a hero," he remarked in an adoring tone. "You're lucky to have him, so. I know he's my partner." she said with a smile and tears in her eyes. The cop nodded. Weck ensures that the report indicates that, had it not been for him, things may have turned out much differently with the... After the intruders were apprehended and the cabin was at last quiet, CLA sat on the floor next to Rocky. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she muttered, putting her arms around him. Rocky licked her face. Despite the chaos and terror, CLA felt at peace as his tail wagged lazily. Although Boone's network might still be a threat, she was confident that, with Rocky at her side, she could handle whatever happened next. The hut was bathed in a warm glow from the early sun that filtered through the trees and dappled the wooden walls. As CLA sat on the front porch, the once chaotic sight seemed serene. Rocky, by her side, was a silent sentinel observing. His keen ears perked up at every sound, but his posture was comfortable. The previous night's events hovered over his domain like a nightmare, although there was an odd consolation after the police told her that the intruders were being held and charged with major crimes. Although they felt that their arrests had damaged the network, they had also advised her to continue being vigilant. When CLA heard tires crunching on gravel, she snapped out of her reverie and looked up to see Mrs. Henderson, her neighbor. The elderly woman arrived with a tray of muffins and a determined look on her face as she got out of her old sedan. Mrs. Henderson spoke about what had transpired, her voice shaking with passion. "You're courageous, CLA, and your dog is exceptional." CLA was able to manage a minor. Mrs. Henderson, Rocky's true hero, smiled as she accepted the basket and thanked Rocky. She misted her eyes and patted Rocky's head, saying, "Heroes come in all shapes and sizes, dear. If you ever need anything, just give me a call. As neighbors, we must support one another." The small act of kindness brought. For a long time, CLA had felt alone and burdened by her past, which brought tears to her eyes. Hefty to share with others, but she now understood that she didn't have to do it by herself. CLA looked about the cabin. The doors damaged from the break-in had been temporarily fixed, and the few objects that had been pushed over were back in place, but the feeling of violation persisted, so she grounded herself by taking a big breath. "We'll make this position even more powerful, won't we, boy?" she asked, observing Rocky's waving tail. Was all she required to feel secure once more. So, CLA called a nearby security firm by. As workers installed cameras and strengthened the windows and doors in the afternoon, she watched them at work, felt more in charge of her life again, and later that day, Officer Ramirez came over to see how she was doing. She was relieved to see his comforting, familiar smile. "How are you holding up?" he inquired in a soft tone. Improved CLA's response. "The security updates are helpful, but I'm still understanding everything. You're stronger than you realize, but it will take time." Ramirez nodded. He knelt down to pet Rocky, who instantly leaned into his touch. "So you know who to contact if you ever need backup. We've been talking about this amazing person down at the station. Do you ever consider reintroducing him?" "What do you mean, Rocky?" "He has instincts that you can't teach. If you wanted to, we could work." Action CLA raised her head in curiosity. "Get him certified as a therapy dog or service dog. He's already a hero, so why not formalize the concept?" Sowed the seed in CLA's mind that although she had always knew Rocky was unusual, the idea of sharing his special talents with. CLA sat on the porch stairs, Rocky's head, and others were fascinating as the sun sank. In sharp contrast to the turmoil of the previous instant, the tranquility felt hard-earned when she was resting on her lap. At night, she reflected on how far she had come since overcoming the hardships, anxieties, and periods of uncertainty from her past. Rocky had been her steadfast defender, friend, and possibly even guardian during all of this. "Indeed," Ramirez said out loud, scratching behind Rocky's ears, "You've a lot more to offer, don't you?" The following morning, CLA, Rocky's tail pounded against the wooden doorstep as though in agreement. Officer Ramirez put her in touch with a nearby trainer when she called the station to find out more about the service dog program. The concept of providing Rocky with a new purpose while continuing to work with retired military dogs improved their relationship, gave her hope, and days stretched into weeks as things gradually got back to normal. Once again, the cabin felt like a haven because to the security precautions in place. Started training with Rocky and was astounded by how fast he picked up new instructions and duties that the community came together to support. her providing assistance in unexpected ways when neighbors dropped by to provide food. One cool autumn morning, CLA and Rocky told her about their own hardships and reassured her that she wasn't alone. Observe a group of kids playing Rocky, who is now a fully certified therapy professional, while standing at the edge of a nearby park. CLA grinned as the kids came over, their laughing filling the air as the dog, wearing a vest that proudly indicated his position. One child asked his wide eyes as they stretched out to pet him, "Is he a superhero dog?" CLA laughed. "You could say that he saved me more times," as his eyes were full with astonishment. The boy smiled and said, "Can I be a superhero too?" To which CLA naturally replied, "Being bold and kind makes anyone a hero," and Rocky leaned down to his level. CLA had a deep feeling of purpose when she was touched by the youngster. She had managed to transform her suffering into something worthwhile. To inspire others with her tale, that evening, while CLA sat with Rocky by the fire, at her feet, she considered the risk, terror, and uncertainty of the voyage that had led her here, taxed her in ways she never would have thought possible, but it also demonstrated her inner strength and the strength of the link. She leaned down and whispered to Rocky, "You're my hero, you know." Rocky's tail waggled in response to his kiss on his head, and his eyes gleamed with devotion and affection. CLA felt prepared for whatever lay ahead as the fire roared and the stars glowed outside. Together, Rocky had endured the darkness and emerged stronger, ready to take on any obstacles that lay ahead. The same manner, did you find CLA and Rocky's tale of bravery and tenacity to be enjoyable side by side? If this video inspires you, please remember to hit the subscribe button, like it, and leave a comment. Leave a comment with what you believe defines a real hero. And check back soon for more amazing tales of bravery, connection, and a unbreakable human-animal link. See you in the upcoming video.